Good morning, everybody. Well done for being here against all the odds. And Courtney, thank you very much for that nice introduction. So yeah, my title is What Makes Kipchoge So Good, the so-called fourth dimension in the physiology of marathon running. So I always start with a bit of a model. A lot of my lectures start with this one, and it's from Mike Joyner from the Mayo Clinic. He published this paper in the Journal of Applied Physiology back in 1991. And it breaks down exercise performance, endurance exercise performance, into its physiological components. So it's relatively straightforward. Here we have the performance speed, or power if we're talking about cycling, but let's concentrate on running, so we're talking about speed or velocity. And what's really important is, because this is an aerobic event, if we're talking about the marathon, is what is the oxygen uptake? What is the performance VO2 that we can hold? Okay? Many of you, I think, will have heard of the maximal oxygen consumption, or VO2 max. That's really important because it sets the ceiling. Clearly, this performance VO2, the oxygen uptake that you can exercise at for a given duration or distance, can't be any higher than that. And we find that this performance VO2 is quite closely associated with something called the lactate threshold, which, again, some of you, I'm sure, will be aware of. This bit is pretty much negligible for the marathon. If you're a middle distance runner, it's much more important, but we can essentially neglect this. But the other thing that's important is this bit here, efficiency or economy. So for running, we talk about running economy. How much oxygen does it take you to transport your body mass over a given distance? And collectively, these two things really help to determine the speed that you can sustain in a race. Really, this translates this oxygen uptake into speed over the ground. Okay? So that's just to sort of set the scene, and I'll tell you a little bit about Kipchoge and where he sort of fits on these criteria as we go through. Now, the reason that having that model is quite important is because it enables us to assess a person's fitness status and give them some recommendations for their training, but it also enables us to predict their performance. So using Joyner's model, we can break it down into this equation where the sustainable fraction of the VO2 max multiplied by the VO2 max divided by the running economy gives you the sustainable marathon speed. But you can simplify it even further, just say what is the sustainable metabolic rate divided by running economy. And I'll give you a little worked example. So if you have somebody, for example, who can sustain 80% of their VO2 max, and they're very fortunate to have a very high VO2 max, in this case of 80 mils per kilogram per minute, the 60 is just a conversion factor, and they also have a running economy of 180 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of their body mass per kilometer, and you can do the sum, and that gives you a sustainable speed, at least theoretically, of 21.33 kilometers per hour, which, given that the marathon's 42.2 kilometers, predicts a 1:58.42 marathon time. Okay? The other thing I just wanted to give you a bit of physiology background before we go any further is just to tell you about the so-called hyperbolic speed-time relationship, which is not as complicated as it might first appear. And what I have here is just the speed that a person can sustain for given amounts of time. So this individual can run at this speed, close to 7 meters per second, for this amount of time, and so forth. So you just get them to run at different distances, work out what's their best time for that distance, and we can create this curve. Now, this curve is quite important because where it eventually levels off gives you this, you end up with this asymptote that you can read off here. And we call that the critical speed. And the critical speed is really important because if you exercise above your critical speed, you simply can't attain a steady state and you fatigue very rapidly. But you can exercise below your critical speed for relatively long periods in a steady state. So the critical speed or the critical power represents the speed which is just above that corresponding to the highest sustainable rate of oxidative metabolism. It therefore represents the threshold between steady state and non-steady state exercise. And it's rather similar, actually, to the calculation of sustainable metabolic rate divided by running economy in that first Joyner model that I showed you a couple of slides ago. Now, the reason that this critical power or critical speed is so important is that when we exercise above our critical speed, we inevitably hit our VO2 max. So even though the speed is constant, VO2 can't be stabilized and it rises with time until we hit our VO2 max. Then we've got very little anaerobic capacity left until we become exhausted. So whether it's for 2 minutes or 20 minutes, we find that VO2 max is reached and exercise intolerance ensues shortly thereafter. And just to sort of prove to you why this critical power or critical speed is so important, if you exercise people at or just below their critical power, this is for cycling, you can see that a steady state in both oxygen uptake and blood lactate concentration can be reached. But you go just a little bit higher than your critical power or critical speed, VO2 doesn't stabilize and rises with time until you hit your VO2 max and you can't go any further. And we also find that your blood lactate concentration rises inexorably until it reaches a very high level and your muscle function begins to fail. And we can look at that not just systemically, but also within the muscle. So this, whether you use magnetic resonance spectroscopy and you assess muscle energetics non-invasively, you see here that phosphocreatine, muscle pH, muscle inorganic phosphate concentration, the critical power in this particular study was 18 watts. When we exercise these participants just 2 watts below that, we find a very rapid steady state can be reached. We exercise them just 2 watts above that critical power, and we find that we get this dramatic sort of precipitous fall in this high energy phosphate within the muscle. The acidity in the muscle gets very high as well. But you can also do it invasively using muscle biopsies, and you essentially find the same thing. So it really does indicate this threshold between something that's sustainable, where you can reach a steady state, and intensities where it is not. Now, functionally, the reason why this critical speed is so important for the marathon is that we find that the best marathon runners in the world operate at a speed that is just below that critical speed, which clearly makes sense, because if they exceed it, then they're going to get this cascade of metabolites which accumulate. They'll use up their muscle glycogen stores very rapidly as well. So we did a little study. Obviously, you can find the personal best performances of elite athletes very easily on the internet these days. And here are some very famous runners that you'll recognize. Haile Gebrselassie, Eliud Kipchoge, Wanjiru. This is Steve Jones, my former clubmate at Newport Harriers, Mo Farah. And this is their critical speed, because you only need to know what was their best time for 1,500 meters, 3K, 5K, and you can calculate their critical speed, something called their D prime, which relates to their anaerobic capacity. At the time we did the study, this was their personal best performance for the marathon. This was the speed that they sustained when they ran their best time for the marathon. And this is the fraction of the critical speed that they sustained in those races. And you can see that it's a very small standard deviation. It's right up close to that critical speed. So these athletes seem to intuitively know where that speed is, and they're able to operate just below it. So I had the great fortune of being associated with the Breaking 2 project that Nike put together a few years ago. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about that. So I've sort of used to be a bit of a runner. I've researched the physiology of distance running, the determinants of elite exercise performance my entire career. But this was really the culmination of it, to bring all of that knowledge together, to try to identify athletes that might be capable of breaking 2 hours for the marathon, and then helping those athletes to achieve that feat, facilitating their performance. So I got the call from Nike, would I be interested in helping them out as an external sort of a consultant on this project. And we published this paper in the Journal of Applied Physiology just last year. It's got a lot of citations, and it's got a lot of interest, and it's called Physiological Demands of Running at 2-Hour Marathon Race Pace. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story from that paper. So I think Mark, our AV man, should be able to play us a few video clips, starting with this one here. Okay, so just to inform you, the first stage of the project was to bring 17 of the best distance runners in the world into the lab, either at Exeter, where I work, or at Portland, Oregon, where Nike are based. And we put them through a rigorous protocol where we measured their VO2 max, their lactate threshold, their running economy, and we put it into the Joyner equation. And we used other criteria as well, but the idea was, of these 17 athletes, which are the ones that actually might have a chance of breaking 2 hours? Because at the time that we started to do this work, the world record was 2:02:57. So it was getting closer and closer, and a few of us at major conferences were starting to speculate about, could it be done? Who would it be done by? What would need to happen to make it a thing? So here's the one in the middle. This is Eliud Kipchoge, the Olympic champion. That one's a little bit glitchy. And the third one is Galen Rupp, the best American runner. So by the way, they're all running here at 21 kilometers per hour, so very close to 2-hour marathon race pace, and it looks like they're making it look fairly easy there, doesn't it? So three excellent athletes. Now, what's the information that we get from that? Let me just show you the protocol that we use. So we do an incremental multi-stage treadmill test. We set the gradient at 1%, and we run them at a variety of different speeds. Typically start at about 17 kilometers per hour. In this, we actually drop them onto the moving treadmill belt at 17. We're able to measure their VO2 kinetics. They eventually reach a steady state. This is a 3-minute exercise stage. There's a short break while we take a blood sample to determine blood lactate concentration, and then they run at these progressively higher speeds. And you can see that it's just 0.5 kilometer per hour increments here, because we really want to nail down where we get these inflection points in blood lactate concentration. So within a 30-minute exercise test, we're able to assess oxygen cost, or running economy, VO2 max, and VO2 kinetics, how rapidly this rises to reach a steady state. The other thing, of course, we get, I mentioned that we also take blood samples and we determine lactate concentration. This is the sort of profile that you get, and this is from, again, Zerzaneh Tedesse, the world half marathon record holder, in the first video clip that I showed you. Again, here's the running speed, here's his blood lactate concentration in red, and here's his heart rate in blue. And you can see that there's a breakpoint here at around 19.5 kilometers per hour. That's what we call the lactate threshold. And just a little bit higher again, 21 kilometers per hour, we see a much more sort of sudden and sustained breakpoint in the lactate curve here. We call that the lactate turn point. We've done a few studies to show that this lactate turn point is a pretty good approximation of the critical speed. So therefore, we'd expect our runners to be able to operate sort of here. Now, remember that in order to break 2 hours for the marathon, you need to be operating at faster than 21.1 kilometers per hour. So anyway, that's the sort of insight that we get from the physiology test that we did on the Breaking 2 athletes. Now, I just want to kind of put that into context. Charlie and I, who work quite frequently with elite distance runners, it's almost possible to get a bit blasé about how good they are. So I just wanted to show you this. So this is a very fit young man, competitive distance runner, pretty decent, 38 minutes for 10K. And he's actually the presenter of a Belgian documentary series on world records. And while we were doing the Breaking 2 project, they were doing a series of documentaries looking at the best, how do you run world records in different sports or different field events, etc. And he wanted to do the same protocol as these elite athletes. So this is what we did with him. Started him at 9 kilometers per hour. You can see the speeds going up. Now he becomes completely exhausted at 17 kilometers per hour. He reaches a heart rate of close to 200 beats per minute, and his blood lactate concentration is around 11 millimolar. In fact, he could barely finish that final stage at 17. Remember, he's a good, fit, healthy, faster than most of us in the room, I dare say. Now, just to put it into context, these are the same data that I showed you on the previous slide from one of the Breaking 2 athletes, and you can see the speed at which this young man became fully exhausted is the speed at which we actually start the test in the elite runners. So for them, running at 17 kilometers per hour is literally a walk in the park. So it's a completely different kettle of fish there. So I think worth contextualizing it in that way. So in terms of the results that we got, so we measured VO2 peak both on the treadmill but also in the field. We actually asked the athletes to run for 2 miles at 2-hour marathon race pace, but then do a sprint finish, do a final 400 meters as fast as they could. So we've measured VO2 max on 2 occasions. On average, the VO2 max was in the low to mid 70s, possibly a bit lower than you might have anticipated, but of course they run nowhere near their VO2 max. It's really the middle distance runners who have the highest VO2 max values. But their lactate turn point was occurring at a relatively high fraction of their VO2 max, 92% pretty much on average. So they're able to operate close to their maximal capacity without accumulating any lactate in their blood. So that's something that's really quite special about these particular athletes, most of which were from East Africa, from Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, and so on. And then here's the oxygen cost or the running economy. Now the average in a regular person is about 200. So if you have a value that's less than that, that means you're using less oxygen to run at a given speed. So that's a good thing. and we find that it's about 190 or so mils per kilogram per minute. But for all three of these variables, you can see that there's quite appreciable inter-individual variability. So it's not one size fits all. You know, they were all excellent athletes, and yet they achieved their performances in slightly different ways. So Eliud Kipchoge was certainly one of the better ones, and we did select him. Of the 17 athletes that we tested, we chose 3 to go further, to have some extra development, to put in place you know, the right programs, we tried to facilitate their performance, and we gave them the opportunity to attempt to break the 2-hour marathon barrier. Good job we did select Eliud Kipchoge, as it turns out. So this was the original Breaking 2 marathon result. You can see Eliud on that occasion crossed the line in 2 hours exactly and 25 seconds. So missed Breaking 2 by 1 second per mile. You know, could have been 1 second per mile faster, would have been 1:59:59. Now, although Eliud was selected, I think it's fair to say that his physiology, at least at the time that we measured him, he wasn't head and shoulders above everybody else. And yet, when it came to his performance, he clearly was head and shoulders above everyone else. So he's about 6.5 minutes faster than Zerzanay Tadesse. Lalisa Desisa, who actually went on to win the World Marathon Championships, didn't have a good day at the office. He'd been injured in his preparations and ran 2:15. But remember, this 2 hours and 25 seconds was more than 2.5 minutes faster than the existing world record. And really, I think this was the most astonishing performance in the history of marathon running. I think it made Breaking 2 actually inevitable. So while he just sort of didn't quite break it on that day, I think there were a lot of skeptics out there, but there weren't many skeptics after this performance. I think it was going to happen. Now, it was only a short while after that where, this was in Monza, in Italy, this is in Vienna. I also advised Ineos on this 1:59 project, and finally Eliud, goes under the magic 2 hours with his 1:59:40. I think it's fair to say that Kipchoge's dominance in the marathon doesn't seem to be entirely explicable by the traditional physiological variables as outlined in the Mike Joyner model. So yes, he's got a great VO2 max. Yes, he's got great running economy. He's got a very high lactate threshold. A lot of them have. And Eliud's profile overall was certainly sufficient that enabled us to select him. But there were others that we thought had a chance too, and yet Eliud has been absolutely dominant over the last 5 or 6 years, or perhaps longer. So why is that? So I've just got another video clip that I'd like Mark to play, if that's possible.
To go to the nearest town on his bike to sell milk at the local market, and now, through hard work and discipline, he's pointing. Come on, he says. Eliud Kipchoge has the hand of history on his shoulder. He has less than 200 meters to go. Eliud Kipchoge, let's keep an eye on the clock, into the final 20 seconds. Eliud Kipchoge has on his shoulder, 140, the unofficial time.
There's his wife.
Eliud Kipchoge storms into the history books in Vienna, 1:59:40.
So what I want you to take from that is actually how easy he made that look. He just is completely unfatigued. And actually, I'll give you a little anecdote. Not long after that, we invited Eliud over to accept an honorary degree from the University of Exeter, which he graciously accepted. But prior to the graduation ceremony, we had a lunch, with the Vice-Chancellor. And the Vice-Chancellor asked him, Eliud, just how hard was it to break 2 hours? And he casually said, it wasn't hard. So and he certainly doesn't look like, he sprinted across that finish line, he's smiling, he doesn't look like he's breathing very hard. I think he could have gone considerably faster on that day. So we need to consider, what is it about these great athletes? Eliud certainly won, Paula, Radcliffe another. There seems to be this fourth dimension. So let's perhaps consider what that might be. Now, prediction of endurance performance using the Joyner model assumes that the 3 parameters, VO2 max, running economy, lactate threshold, or the critical speed, remain constant during endurance exercise. That's the presumption. But is that really true? So I'm going to show you just a few bits of data from the PhD thesis of Ida Clark, this was a PhD studentship that was co-sponsored by Nike. And we asked the question, we did a series of studies, is this really true? What happens during longer-term fatiguing endurance exercise? How do these variables change? And could that explain why some people are better able to endure than others? So this is a study that we published in Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise, effects of 2 hours of heavy intensity exercise on the power-duration relationship. What you can see here, this is heart rate against time, it's obviously 2 hours. We can see a bit of a cardiovascular drift. Heart rate is gradually rising with time, as you'd expect. But also we find that oxygen uptake rises with time as well. So while the power output is constant, this was on a cycle ergometer, the energy cost isn't. It's actually costing you more and more energy. So you become less efficient as the exercise goes on. And this is related to changes in muscle glycogen concentration. That's the carbohydrate still within your muscle. So you take a muscle biopsy pre-exercise, and then after 2 hours, we can see that in every single individual, obviously muscle glycogen concentration falls. Now what happens when that occurs and you're less able to rely on carbohydrate metabolism is that you have to use fat. And it actually costs you more oxygen to resynthesize ATP from fat compared to carbohydrate. So that's why we get this drift upwards in VO2. What we also did was measure critical power, so the equivalent to critical speed. We did something called a 3-minute all-out test, which is really, really hard. You just sprint as hard as you can on a cycle ergometer for 3 minutes. We find that power output's really high in the first few seconds, but then it falls really rather rapidly, but eventually levels off. And it's been shown that the power output at which it levels off is very close to the critical power. So what we did on one occasion, on a fresh day, we brought them to the lab and we measured their critical power. We got them to do this 3-minute all-out test. And then on another occasion, they came to the lab, they did 2 hours of heavy intensity cycle exercise, and then immediately they did a 3-minute all-out test. It's pretty brutal. But here you can see this is the fresh condition, and this is the fatigued condition. And you can clearly see that actually throughout the entire bout, but certainly over this last period as well, that the power output is lower. So their critical power has fallen. And overall, we found about a 24-watt difference, and the critical power has fallen 8% from a fresh state to what you see after 2 hours of exercise. But there was a wide range of individual responses, with the fall in critical power being as small as 1% in some people and as much as 22% in others. So the group mean of 8% doesn't tell you the whole story. Some people appear to be more fatigue resistant than others. And we concluded in that paper that our results indicate that performance during long duration endurance events might depend not only on the value of key physiological variables at baseline, as is assumed in the Joyner model, but also on the extent to which these variables deteriorate as exercise proceeds. We went on to look at what happens sort of to map the time course of this change in critical power. So in addition to getting them to do this 3-minute all-out critical power test in a fresh state and after 2 hours, on different days we got them to do 40 minutes of exercise, stopped them, 3-minute all-out test, and on another day again they did 80 minutes. So we're able to track the time course with which this deterioration occurs. And interestingly, after 40 minutes there's not really any fall. After 80 minutes, there's not really any fall, but after 120 minutes, you get this big drop-off. So most of the deterioration that we see happens over the tail end of this. So what are the implications of this dynamic critical speed for endurance exercise performance? Well, here's your marathon speed, which I've plotted here as a constant in the red line, and here's your critical speed. And what we now know, of course, that this doesn't remain stable, but actually starts to fall away. And there's going to be a point, you hope this happens right on the finish line. If it happens any earlier than the finish line, you go from a steady state condition to a non-steady state condition. You'll accumulate all those fatigue-related metabolites. You'll use your glycogen even more rapidly. You'll basically hit the wall, and things could get painful from here onwards, okay? So because we now know that the critical speed might fall by up to 10% during a marathon race, this suggests that the fraction of 96% that I showed you amongst those elite athletes earlier, that might be the average, but you might start off at about 92% of your critical speed, but you're going to end up at about 100% by the end. And therefore, a faster marathon race time requires either a higher absolute critical speed, and if you do Kipchoge's calculations, his critical speed is phenomenally high, and or a greater resilience. So a smaller reduction in critical speed as the race progresses, or a less deterioration of the running economy. So what are the possible determinants of this physiological resilience? probably a high percentage of type 1 or slow twitch muscle fibers, probably a high mitochondrial density, therefore muscle oxidative capacity and capillarity, so the ability to deliver plentiful oxygen to the muscles, but also to use that in an efficient way. We think also anthropometry and biomechanics are going to be important as well here, in particular the stretch shortening cycle. So when you run, you lose energy to the environment. We find the East Africans in particular have long Achilles tendons, and that may enable them to store more of that energy and return it in the next stride. Training might be something as well, and that's something I'm just going to come back to in a few slides' time. And some extrinsic interventions, nutrition and equipment. I'll tell you a little bit about that as well. Now, since our 2018 study looking at how critical speed fell during endurance exercise, quite a few other groups have sort of joined in on this. So here's a paper from just last year in Sports Medicine, the importance of durability and the physiological profiling of endurance athletes. And what they did in this study was they asked athletes to report what was their self-reported speed over the course of a race. And you can see that up to about 70% or so of the race, they're able to maintain what they wish to, but then the speed actually typically tends to fall away. They were also asked to self-report the fraction of their maximal heart rate at which they exercised, but we again see that it's pretty stable up to about 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the race, and then it starts to go up. So you've got a situation either where your heart rate is stable but your speed is falling, or your speed is constant and your heart rate's going up, neither of which is ideal. So you're starting to decouple. You know, before that point, you're in a pretty good steady state. You can make that index even more sensitive if you do a decoupling ratio and you plot the percentage of heart rate max divided by the percentage of speed change. And here we see an even more dramatic sort of breakpoint here. And of course, we live in the era of big data. And there's a study here which looked at the internal and external workload during a marathon in 82,000 athletes. And they were able to show that there were low decouplers, mid decouplers, and very high decouplers. So this extent of decoupling does vary quite substantially between people. So the extent of the decoupling and the time at which it occurred was very much related to the finish time. So those that had the fastest finish time, this is 2.5 hours, didn't decouple very much. And when they did decouple, it was relatively later into the race compared to these other groups. So typically it was about a 16% decoupling, and it was first detected at 25 kilometers into the race. Big inter-individual variation. The low decoupling group completed the marathon faster, had better performance, and first experienced this decoupling later on. Interestingly, females had a reduced magnitude and later occurrence of decoupling compared to males. Now, whether that's a physiological difference or simply better pacing, we're not really sure. And we found that marathon race time was strongly associated with the magnitude and the time of onset of the decoupling. And the authors found that including a decoupling metric significantly enhanced the prediction of marathon performance. Just got a couple more slides, so I know you're getting twitchy there, but I'm nearly finished. So here's an example of physiological resilience. So here's Jake Smith, one of Britain's greatest distance runners at the moment. I've just started working with him recently. You'll be familiar with this sort of lactate and heart rate profile now. You know that he should be able to operate just below his lactate turn point. So let's say he's able to run at 20.5 kilometers per hour. That's 4 minutes and 42 seconds per mile, and at a heart rate of about 173 beats per minute. Now, because social media is a big thing these days, and Jake Smith is very happy to share all of his data on Instagram and elsewhere. He actually acted as a pacemaker in a big city marathon fairly recently, did the first 17 miles. You can see here that the speed that he ran at was pretty much exactly 4:42 per mile, and he was able to hold a heart rate of about 173 beats per minute. So no sign of him decoupling at least to 17 miles. So that's pretty good. He only has another 9 miles still to go, but the high hopes that somebody like Jake Smith has the ability, has this fatigue resistance or resilience to enable him to run a very fast marathon one day. Now, so the million-dollar question, this isn't Eliud's paycheck from last week. Well, it might be, but can anything be done to improve this resilience? I'm sure you're asking that question. So obviously the first thing might be training. This is the sort of training that Eliud Kipchoge does. They do easy 50 or 60 minutes in the evening. Most of the training they do in the morning is in a fasted condition, track session on a Tuesday, fartlek session on a Saturday and a very long run on a Thursday. And this can be up to 25 miles, where even though it's at high altitude, hilly course, terrible underfoot conditions, they'll often run that 25 miles in about 2 hours 15. But it starts very slowly and it gets progressively faster and faster and faster. There might be 100 people to begin with. There's probably just Eliud left at the end. So having this fatigue resistance could be trainable through this process. As you get more and more tired, you actually practice running faster and faster. 17 miles a day, 120 miles per week with a pyramidal training intensity distribution. So this is the one run that Eliud never wants to miss. He thinks that's crucial for his preparations. We also looked at carbohydrate ingestion during long duration exercise as well. If you feed people carbohydrate, you maintain their blood glucose at a higher level, and you find that they're able to oxidize carbohydrate at a higher rate compared to when they just take a placebo that doesn't contain carbohydrate. And what we find here when we do that critical power measurement, as per the previous studies, is that when they just take the placebo drink, again, their critical power falls by 8% or so. If you feed them carbohydrate at just 60 grams per hour, we find that they are able to maintain their critical power. In fact, this value here isn't different from this one. So if those of you that are running tomorrow, do take the opportunity if you can, not only to start the race with high glycogen levels, but use drink stations to take carbohydrate on board to try to maintain that. I ought to say something about the so-called super shoes these days. We did a study recently. This is in a standard shoe. This is in a super shoe. For any given running speed, you can see that the oxygen cost is less. In other words, running economy is better. We find that performance is better too. And we find that simply by lacing on the shoes, you get a rightward shift of the lactate-speed relationship. So you're able to run at a higher speed for the same effort. So that's pretty important. Now, what happens in the latter stages of a marathon, nobody quite knows. This is the effect on running economy, in the first period of a race, is probably even larger towards the tail end of a race because you're sort of sparing the muscle damage that you would otherwise have. And another element of this study is that we measured running economy both in a fresh and in a muscle-damaged condition, and the effect was just as potent in the damaged state. So to conclude, I hope I've convinced you that the physiological parameters of endurance performance are not static, they are indeed dynamic, and they change during fatiguing endurance exercise. Performance, therefore, isn't just about the physiological status on the start line. It may discriminate the best of the best. It's also about how those variables change. Therefore, I would argue that this resilience or fatigue resistance, endurability, if you wish, should be considered the fourth parameter of endurance exercise physiology. There are clearly implications for physiological testing for those sports scientists in the room because we insist that our athletes come to the lab in a fresh condition. And yet for the majority of the race, they're going to be fatigued. And we actually need to know to what extent they can maintain these variables that we know to be important in that fatigue condition. And clearly we need more research, both to understand the mechanisms that underpin this resilience and interventions that we might use to improve it. So just finally, going back to that model, there it all is. The one thing I would do to modify it is add resilience in there, because it's not just about these things at the start line, it's how they change with time, which will dictate the performance speed that can be maintained. So we got to the finish line. Thank you very much for your attention. I'd like to thank Eliud and all the other elite athletes that I've had the pleasure of working with for the insight they've given me into the limitations to endurance exercise performance. Cheers.
Thank you very much. It really was fascinating. Shall we take a couple of questions now? There will be time to ask questions about your break time and at the end. A couple of questions.
No, I'll move on the effect.
Can you take the microphone? Would you mind?
Can you comment on the effect of caffeine?
Yeah, certainly caffeine is one of the few nutritional supplements which have been shown to be ergogenic. So again, I wouldn't recommend that if you're not used to using caffeine, you suddenly start experimenting with it tomorrow. But in Breaking 2, some of the athletes use caffeine pre-race, and we also use some drinks that were spiked with caffeine at 13 miles and 20 miles. So it can give a bit of a lift later in the race. So caffeine is certainly something that can be beneficial.
Cheers, thanks for the talk. That was brilliant. I was expecting to see his water bottle guy in there as well after the weekend. But do you find that with Kipchoge that he's able to withstand a higher volume of training in comparison to some of those other elite athletes that you tested in the breaking two?
No, I wouldn't necessarily say that. So of the 3 athletes that we selected, Eliud's mileage was about in the middle. We had one of the athletes did a much larger volume, but at a much lower intensity, and the other one did a much lower volume, but at a much higher intensity. And I think Eliud probably had the right balance. The other 2 athletes, in retrospect, we might have intervened with to change their training a little bit. Eliud, we didn't bother. You know, he's running good performances anyway, but we like the balance in his program. He does the same volume in his training camp as everybody else, so he doesn't do more. I do think that the super shoe, I started to talk a bit about that. They don't just race in the super shoe, they now train in the super shoe as well. And they are, you know, anecdotally, because it's so well cushioned, as you probably know, they're able to soak up that volume with much less damage, much less fatigue. So whether that means in future they'll be able to do more volume or the same volume a little bit faster, I'm not sure, but I think they go to the start line in a slightly better condition than they were in the past. It isn't just, you know, the acute effect of the super shoe, it's chronic as well as acute.
Thank you very much. There will be time to ask Andy more questions later, so I'm going to say thank you very
Thank
much.
you.